I'm going to talk about populism, Aristotle, and hope. And I want to begin by reflecting on a very peculiar change in our civilization and our culture. We are sitting here in a room in which is embodied many of the fantasies of a previous era. I don't want you to turn around too much while I'm talking, but you can see behind you tapestries of knights in shining armor galloping in a tourney on London Bridge. You can see William the Conqueror's representative turning up to meet the City of London. And over my left shoulder in the stained glass, you'll see pictures of earnest clerics. And everywhere around us, in the stones, in the heraldry, is a reminder of an age that's past, an age which was defined by a sense of religion and spirituality at the very heart of our political construct, defined by rigid divisions between classes, the domination of the lords and the bishops over our society. And that world gradually evaporated and was replaced over time, over many hundreds of years, by the beginning of a liberal democratic consensus, whose fundamental elements by the 1990s had become the idea of liberal democracy and the free market. But this evolution, this change, was a matter of many, many hundreds of years. In fact, in a sense, this whole panoply of buildings is like an ancient oak tree whose bark somehow remains while the center has been hollowed out. In some ways, in fact, the entire British Constitution is a little bit like that. You only have to go and peer at the House of Lords, see the bishops in the House of Lords to get a bit of a sense of that. But what is so startling is how rapid the change has been from the consensus of the 1990s to today. How something that previously took many hundreds of years has happened in a matter of decades. And I want to quickly run you through some of that change and examine some of the paradoxes and contradictions which we've lived through. Let me start with 1989, very obvious moment, fall of the Berlin Wall, and the beginning of what appeared to be the explosion of an age of liberal optimism, an age dominated by the US and its allies. Going into the end of the 1980s, we are entering a world in which the United States stands unchallenged. And over the years between 1989 and 2004, the number of democracies in the world doubles. Not just in Central and Eastern Europe, we're familiar with what happened in Hungary or Slovakia, but in Latin America, in Asia, and even in some parts of the Middle East. And as this begins to change, we see other developments. We see the developments of peace. Every year from then onwards, as Steven Pinker likes to celebrate, the world appears to become more peaceful. Every year there are fewer civilians killed in conflict. There are fewer internally displaced people. There are fewer refugees. And the world becomes more prosperous, so much so that the world ends up on track to meet its goal of halving global poverty 4 years early. Hundreds of millions of people are dragged out of extreme poverty in this period. And this period, characterized, I would say, probably by 5 things, and I want you to try to keep these 5 things in your head as I plod my way through my lecture. The first of those is the notion of consensus. This is an era in the 1990s, an era of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, where the conventional wisdom is that politics, democratic elections, are won in the center ground. The classic graph of public opinion in this period is a bell jar. The votes are sitting where my fingers are, not where my elbows are. The conventional wisdom is you need to scoop up the votes at the fingers. The second assumption of this period is that there is a clear vision for prosperity, and that is driven by free open global markets. The third element of this moment is an idea that there is an ineluctable and inescapable connection between democracy and prosperity, that these free open markets and a liberal democratic system are combined. And this is something which I will explore in a second, but is the core of what's called modernization theory in the United States from the 1950s onwards. The idea basically here being that as you grow more prosperous, you are inevitably going to become a democracy. Once your middle class gets to a certain size, it's going to demand freedoms, and indeed your economic system is going to require those freedoms in order to grow. So prosperity creates democracy, democracy creates prosperity. The fourth element of this system in the 1990s is the idea of the moral legitimacy of the West. Moral legitimacy of the West. And this is seen in the interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo, and in Sierra Leone and Liberia. These are interventions of the late 1990s. In these interventions, the United States and its allies takes it upon themselves to intervene, to do these humanitarian interventions. For the first time, state sovereignty is broken by military invasions in the name of human rights. The idea is that we're going into Bosnia to protect the Bosnian Serb population in Sarajevo, 37,000 of whom have died from the Serbian artillery around the fringes. We're going into Kosovo to back the Kosovar Albanian population against the oppression of Slobodan Milosevic. And in Liberia and Sierra Leone, we are intervening against child soldiers and civil war. And this is based on a fundamental idea that we have the moral legitimacy, that other countries want to be like us. People do not want to live in tyrannies. They want to move to the United States. They want to move to Britain because we believe our system is better. And the fifth element of this, which comes out of much of what precedes it, is the idea that this is universal, that there is something called a liberal global order, that this liberal global order is just going to grow and grow. If the number of democracies in the world has doubled in that period of 15 years, it's just going to double again. And pretty soon every country in the world is going to be a democracy because we're right, we're good, these things are logically connected, and they're all going to come together. So, a nice moment, it appears, for the world. And a moment that evaporates astonishingly quickly and begins to go wrong in the early 2000s. The early 2000s, we enter a period where on almost every indicator I've mentioned, we move from dramatic growth to a form of paralysis and uncertainty. The ideas, the forms, the developments which have characterized the 1990s begin to reemerge in slightly more grotesque shapes. Slight echoes of the past, repetitions which are somewhere between tragedy and comedy. The most dramatic of all, of course, being the way in which Iraq and Afghanistan does and does not reflect what happened in Bosnia and Kosovo. But a series of these events, and these events hit every one of our 5 central pillars of the 1990s. The first of those, which attacks the notion of consensus, right, my fingers, is the development of social media. Twitter and Facebook begin to develop in 2003, 2004, and they reach their apogee in 2011 as a political form with the Arab Spring. Suddenly, for the first time, somebody setting himself alight in Tunisia, a man setting himself alight in a small town in Tunisia, is able to spark unrest, uprising, revolution across Libya, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Bahrain. This is a very, very surprising phenomenon, because in previous eras, you would have argued the differences between those countries. They're different in their sectarian composition, They're different in their constitutions, they're different in their geographical location, and it seems fundamentally implausible that somebody in a small town in Tunisia would be able to spark this kind of change. The second thing that happens in this period is going to strike the notion that free markets and globalization and prosperity are necessarily connected. And this is, of course, the 2008 financial crisis. The 2008 financial crisis is devastating. Devastating for the credibility of our economic system, devastating also for the credibility of our elites, devastating for the bankers, devastating for the politicians who failed to anticipate it, and devastating, of course, most fundamentally, because it leads in countries like Britain to 15 years of frozen GDP per capita and frozen productivity, exposing that the dreams of the 1990s have actually, in the case of many people, particularly on low incomes, corresponded with stagnant incomes and rising inequality. The third thing that happens in this period is a challenge to the notion of the necessary connection between prosperity, free markets, and democracy. And that, of course, is symbolized in our period by the rise of China. The modernization theorists of the 1950s and 1960s fundamentally held that it would not be possible to reach a certain economic weight, for your middle class to get to a certain size, for a certain GDP per capita to be surpassed, without you becoming a liberal democratic state. China joins the World Trade Organization in 2001. In 2005, China's economy becomes larger than the French economy. 2006, it becomes larger than the British economy. 2007, it becomes larger than the German economy. 2008, it becomes larger than the Japanese economy. 900 million people are pulled out of poverty, and the Chinese middle class becomes very large and very considerable. However, China does not convert into a liberal democracy. In fact, sustained growth of nearly 9.5% since 1980 appears to be compatible with the retention of a highly authoritarian system, solidified in 2012 by Xi Jinping becoming the ruler of China and the moves that he makes to tighten party control and his own authoritarian rule. The fourth big change that happens in this period is a challenge to the notion of our moral legitimacy or superiority. And that actually is in some way combined with social media. Because social media begins not only to polarize, but to unlock various unstable coalitions of dissent, and begins to question the fundamental hierarchies that have preceded it. We see it in the media landscape. We see it in the shift away from everybody watching the same BBC programs, or in the United States watching the same news anchors, to a world in which we begin to atomize into various different, very separate echo chambers. But we see it also fundamentally in the ways in which the West begins to challenge itself, and particularly the ways in which young people and movements in the West begin to challenge the authority of the old system. We see it, of course, very, very dramatically in the environmental movement and the way in which fundamental challenges in the 2000s about the environment and climate begin to challenge the construction of our economic system. We begin to see it in 2013, which is the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. We begin to see it increasingly in a concern that our own states, Britain, the United States, through their histories of racism or colonialism, are not in fact morally legitimate actors, but are deeply indicted in structures of inequity. And the fifth development of this period is, of course, the loss of the idea of the global liberal order, which stems from some of those previous factors, but is exemplified and revealed to us most dramatically by the humiliations in Iraq and Afghanistan. There, most dramatically of all, the fundamental idea that it's possible for the United States and its allies to topple, in Afghanistan, a Taliban theocracy what seemed to us to be self-evidently a repellent, oppressive system and replace it with a more liberal democratic model, or in Iraq, topple Saddam Hussein, the epitome of the grotesque dictator, and replace it with a more liberal democratic system, is exposed as optimistic folly. The United States and its allies spend $3.5 trillion in these enterprises in Iraq and Afghanistan. That is incidentally the same amount of money that China, beginning in 2013, begins to spend on the Belt and Road Initiative. However, China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's endeavor to build dams, roads, ports, electricity substations right the way across Pakistan, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, of course, returns far more to China than this extraordinary extravagance in Iraq and Afghanistan. This then leads us, with a degree of hysteria, into the third age that I want to examine, and that's the third age that begins in 2014. And because these changes are happening so fast, many people don't notice they're happening. Let me take a classic example of this. A classic example of this whole world is a figure called, who many of you in the room may struggle to remember, but a figure called David Cameron. So David Cameron enters working life as in the Conservative Research Department, the end of 1988, the beginning of 1989. And it is, of course, true for him, as for most of us, that first 15 years of working life defines your worldview for life. So he is coming into his working life with the fall of the Berlin Wall. He brings in, actually, as his chief of staff, somebody who's been Paddy Ashdown's chief of staff in Bosnia. He sees the world through the lens of humanitarian intervention. He has no idea of social media. He doesn't anticipate the 2008 financial crisis. He remains deeply committed to an idea of an old global order. And he remains in this world until 2005, when he is elected as the Conservative Party leader. And from then onwards, I can assure you, as an ex-politician, one no longer has the time to think. The key thing to understand about leaders of political parties, and particularly prime ministers, is that they're spending so much time on their focus groups, their polling groups, their campaigns, and simply trying to survive in the barrage and hostile media attention and the opposition, that the idea of actually being able to have any time to think about policy in global forms is for the birds. This actually pointed out to me when I left Harvard University, came into British politics, by Mitt Romney, who took me aside and said to me, "How much longer are you at Harvard?" And I said, 4 weeks. He said, "That's the last 4 weeks you're going to have to think in your life." Right? So David Cameron comes in 2005, and you can see the ways in which his experience from 1989 to 2005 defines his missteps as he moves forward. You can see it in his inability to predict the financial crisis. You can see it in the ways in which his intervention in Libya, his attempts to propel an intervention into Syria, are very much part of an old world where he imagines the West is still going to be able to act in the way that it did in Bosnia and Kosovo. You can see it in his great, great reluctance to vote against Iraq or Afghanistan. He continues to endorse those interventions and is extremely reluctant to see any problems with them. You can see it in his relationship to social media. Famously, in an interview in 2009, he said he had no intention of using Twitter because, as far as he was concerned, people who used Twitter were twats. It's David Cameron's great comment. And so he's not a man who is prepared for the world that is about to erupt. And you can see this from 2014 onwards. So 2014 is the beginning of the age of populism. And it's an age of populism where all these factors that I've mentioned are beginning to accelerate a very dramatic shift in the moral values, the political assumptions, the economic models, and indeed the very state structures of the West. We see this first in 2014 when a barely known group, ISIS, manages with a few hundred fighters to rout 3 divisions of the Iraqi army, capture Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, and create a caliphate that stretched from Syria into Iraq, breaking that border. And this is very much a movement fueled by social media. But the same year is also the year in which Narendra Modi is elected in India, bringing a particular form of Hindu ethno-nationalism in replacement of the old structures, the old assumptions of the Congress Party in India. 2014 is also the moment where we see a shift in Erdogan. And maybe it's worth thinking a little bit about Erdogan, because if David Cameron is a symbol of the old era, 1989 to 2005, Erdogan is a symbol of somebody transitioning into the new era. So, Erdogan was from a very, very poor background in Turkey. He, in his teens, was to be found on the streets selling water bottles to truck drivers and simit, which is a sort of giant pretzel. And you'll see young boys, young girls like that if you drive through Istanbul even today. Right? These are people, he's from a very, very low-income background. He probably didn't go to university, although he currently claims that he got some kind of degree. Nobody can find any record of it anywhere in the Turkish system. But in the late 1990s, he became the mayor of Istanbul. And he drove through some very, very impressive infrastructure investments, particularly in bridges and roads. And by the early 2000s, when he's beginning to come to national power in Turkey, he becomes the great hope of the West. He seems to epitomize the possibility of Turkey joining this liberal global order. He's pro-European, he endorses gay rights, he abolishes the death penalty, and he becomes, for people like the European Stability Initiative, a hope that actually democracy may flow not just through Turkey, because of course he's also moving against the military regime in Turkey, but that it may eventually spread from Turkey right through the whole of the Middle East. 2014, however, the beginning of the age of populism, is the year in which a very different Erdogan emerges. Erdogan as president. This is the year in which, when 1,000 Turkish academics protest against military operations against the Kurds, immediately they are arrested, about half of them lose their jobs, about 20 of them remain in jail. This is the moment at which journalists begin to become arrested. This is the moment at which, perhaps most dramatically of all, Erdogan completes the construction of his $350 million presidential palace, representing a different vision of the leader to the man who is selling simit on the streets in his teens. Moving forward through the age of populism, 2015, we see the Law and Justice Party come to power in Poland. 2016 is, of course, the Brexit referendum in Britain. 2018, Bolsonaro takes over in Brazil. And Bolsonaro is simply a symbol of something that is happening in a very accelerated fashion across Latin America, and whose legacy is with us today. Latin America basically follows the model that I've laid out to you. Latin America goes from various forms of autocratic, military-backed regimes in the 1980s and finds itself, late 1980s, early 1990s, entering this liberal world order. Technocrats emerge in Chile and Peru and Mexico and Brazil and Colombia. These are people who are great darlings of the international community, who push ahead with Washington consensus economic reforms, and who, broadly speaking, stand for a centrist technocratic vision of their country. But many of the things that we've explored, transformations in social media, transformations in the global economy, and particularly for Latin America, a later commodity crash, not so much the financial crisis, but for them, commodity crashes in 2013, 2014, begin to open the door to these bizarre figures. People like Boric in Chile, Trujillo, and of course Bolsonaro, on the left and the right, coming forward. But in the center of this period, in the center of 2016, the person who epitomizes the age of populism most is, of course, that great orange, grotesque Donald Trump, right? And we see in his election how all the features that have defined the 1990s, the 5 features that I have identified, are beginning to be replaced by a very, very different universe. So I talked about the first assumption of this period, which is the idea of consensus, the idea that we agree. Remember, I had my fingers in the middle and my elbows at the side. But in this new age, starting in 2014, with apologies to Lloyd with a culinary reference, my fingers collapse like the kind of souffle I make at home. The graph of public opinion becomes a U-shape. There are no votes left where my fingers are, and all the votes are now at my elbows. The votes have moved to the extremes. And this is particularly clear, of course, in Donald Trump in the United States, where the country begins to feel as though it's teetering on the edge of a civil war. But actually, it's true with Brexit too. For the first time, we see in the Brexit Remain conversations a situation in which half of Brexit voters say in interviews that they would not consider having a conversation with a Remainer, and half of Remain voters say the same. And in fact, in the same polls in this period, only 25% from either camp would consider one of their children marrying somebody who came from the other camp. So that's the collapse of consensus. The second feature of this phenomenon is, as I said, the necessary connection that seemed to exist between global, open, free markets and prosperity. And this is very much challenged by the emerging populist age. Donald Trump, of course, is an avowed out-and-out protectionist. He goes into a trade war with China. And we are entering an age in which it is assumed, with reason, that 2008 demonstrated that the old liberal market Washington consensus had not delivered for people. And where particularly in Rust Belt communities or in the northeast of England, people are looking for a different form of industrial strategy, a different form of investment, and no longer have confidence in the market to deliver for them in the way that they were led to believe it might in the 1990s. The third thing, of course, continues to accelerate. I was talking about the link between prosperity and democracy. During this period, we see the opposite of what we saw in the 1990s. In the 1990s, the number of democracies in the world steeply increases. From 2014 onwards, the number of democracies in the world begins to decrease, as increasingly around the world, people begin to question the link between prosperity and democracy, and where many voters, and certainly many politicians around the world, begin to wonder whether prosperity might not be more important than democracy. Talked about Latin America. It's a dramatic example of this at the moment is in El Salvador, with a president who's managed to not just embrace Bitcoin as his national currency, thus relating to my comments about technology and change, but has also locked up about 5% of his population, imposed an extreme authoritarian rule, and has been rewarded with 85% popularity in the ratings. We can see it in Saudi Arabia, where Mohammed bin Salman has imposed an extremely authoritarian state, but combined it with forms of cultural, social liberalization, which have allowed women to drive, have led to an explosion of public music festivals, tourism, cafes, restaurants, a cultural transformation which has not been combined with any changes in human rights, liberal democracy, and where he too has been rewarded at the moment with enormous popularity ratings and economic growth this year of 9.5%. It's a country in the G20, soon to be in the top 15 economies in the world. And a similar story could be told about UAE. In sadder ways, things are beginning to happen in Africa during this period. So we found ourselves, the pre-2014 period, at the back end of this idea of the liberal global order, and you can see it in Francophone Africa, the French deploying troops into places like Mali, advisors into Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic, trying to support pseudo-democratic governments against Islamist insurgency. By today, all those situations have flipped over. The French have been thrown out of those countries in the Sahel. Military coups have happened, and these new military juntas in the Central African Republic, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, most recently in Sudan, are beginning to turn to Russian Wagner mercenaries to come in and provide the support that they previously would have received from the West. The fourth point, legitimacy, the moral legitimacy of the West. Well, the attacks on the moral legitimacy of the West have, of course, accelerated. But it helps the populist cause, because fundamentally populism, whether under Donald Trump or under Boris Johnson, is a narrative of the people against the elite. And the more that the elite is discredited, the more the elite is made to seem selfish, in the words of Occupy Wall Street, the 1%, the out of touch, the corrupt, the more it suits the populist cause, the easier it is for politicians in Poland or Hungary to seem to stand for the real, pure national people against this discredited elite. But it's also true that the crack between prosperity and democracy also means that the same populists are able to challenge their own constitutions. There is a degradation of democratic practice. We can see it in microcosm in Britain, but in much more dramatic forms, of course, with the January 6th uprising in the United States. But in microcosm, you can see it even in Britain. You can see it in the way that Boris Johnson set out consistently to undermine most of the unwritten rules that governed the way in which Parliament and our democracy worked. He started first by challenging the way the Conservative Party worked. Harold Macmillan, elected as Conservative leader, 1950s, makes a great acceptance speech in which he says he will not even consider the idea of purging or eliminating people from the left or the right. He says the Conservative Party is, in one of his great metaphors, fed by many tributaries into a great stream. I embrace left and right, and I will want them on my left hand and my right hand, and we'll march forward together. This was not the vision of Boris Johnson, right? Boris Johnson's vision instead was to take power and immediately expel 21 members of the Conservative Party from Parliament because they happened to represent a different one-nation tradition. And these people included, Churchill's grandson, included Ken Clarke, who'd held almost all the great offices of state and had been a Conservative leadership candidate, been in every Conservative government from the 1970s onwards, is thrown out the door. He then proceeds to try to prorogue Parliament, try to lock the door on Parliament in order to drive through his particular policies. He's then challenged by the Supreme Court that forces him to reopen Parliament, and instead of making a speech of the sort that David Cameron probably would have made or Tony Blair would have made, which is sort of grudging deference to the rule of law, acceptance to the Supreme Court, he stands up and spits fury, talks about the people against the elite, talks about how the Supreme Court is wrong, talks about how the whole thing is a disgusting conspiracy to try to prevent the will of the people. And notice, in this rhetoric, the will of the people is not, of course, all the people. It's barely a majority of the people in most of these cases, but it's nevertheless represented as the people. You can see it also, actually, in the development of conflict of interests, the degradation of the ministerial code. Again, Britain is a minor example of this, but remember, when he's challenged for lying in Parliament and someone points out this is in contravention of the ministerial code, his solution is to rewrite the ministerial code to make it no longer necessary to resign if you lie to Parliament. But, of course, much more dramatic form in Poland, where we really do see the judges appointed by Parliament and the parliamentary commissions, the judicial commissions, completely excluded by the Law and Justice Party, bringing Poland into a deep, deep conflict with the European Union. We can see it in Hungary with the development, essentially the absorption of the state media, the closing of universities, and we can see it, of course, in much more dramatic form in India, in Brazil, and, of course, in Trump's United States. And then the final thing that comes out of this is, of course, the question of the liberal world order. That was the fifth of my things. And during this period, the liberal world order collapses really because the other facet of populism in its new form is isolationism. We move into a world in which we are retreating. One indication of this, and many, many indications of this, but one dramatic indication of this is the cutting of international aid budgets around the world. When I was the Africa minister, I had a bilateral development budget of about $4.5 billion. Today, my equivalent would have in the UK, and I wasn't the Africa minister that long ago, this is 2018 to today, would have a budget of about 1 billion. It's about a quarter. The rest of that money has either been cut, the 0.7% commitment's been cut down to 0.5%, or it's been diverted into looking after refugees in the United Kingdom. And the same situation is happening in Sweden, the same situation is happening in Norway, and the United States is about to announce enormous cuts to its international humanitarian spend, having held the burden that the rest of the world was dropping. And this isolationism is driven by two things. It's driven by the right, increasingly thinking it's none of our business, we don't care about them anyway, and by the left, feeling so guilty that they feel all we do is cause trouble everywhere we go in the world and maybe we shouldn't get involved at all. Meanwhile, the number of people in extreme poverty in Africa has gone from 170 million in 1980 to 470 million people today. And yet, do you hear anybody talking anymore about ending poverty? Are there any more Live Aid concerts? Nothing of the sort. Instead, donations to Red Nose Day goes from 30 million during my period, rises to 100 million, and has now dropped down to 30 million again, as a single indication of this move towards isolation and away from our global responsibilities. Now, I promised Aristotle, and I'm bringing Aristotle and hope to conclude. How do we begin to respond to this? Well, the traditional way of responding to this would be within a classic Enlightenment utilitarian perspective, and that was basically the way in which we saw the world in the 1990s. We had an idea that there was a relatively simple world which was not particularly concerned with moral values, was fundamentally governed by economists, and had a very clear idea of means, ends, calculations, and actually a relatively Machiavellian worldview. This is then developed by the populists into a much coarser and more extreme Machiavellian worldview, in which the end clearly justifies the means, and most of the moral qualms begin to get shifted aside. In fact, many of the populist leaders portray themselves as unashamed rogues. They're able to create these very curious coalitions where they can get religious voters voting for them despite being flamboyantly adulterous, mendacious, and the rest. And what they seem to reveal appears at first to be a lesson from Aristotle. It appears at first that the populists are the people who understand Aristotle. Because what the populists understand is that one of the problems that has hit the liberal democratic consensus in the 1990s is that it's unbelievably boring. The 1990s is actually characterized by a world in which, because everything had been sorted, because we knew how markets created economic growth, because we knew that economic growth created democracy, because we knew that history had ended, a lot of politics in the center ground in this period is largely a process of finding a think tank who's done a little study on something happening in Sweden and then trying to import best practice and capacity building into your civil service. Because fundamentally the idea is that all the big issues have been solved, and all that's required really is a good managerial technique and a prime ministerial delivery unit to drive through the kind of change that you need. But Aristotle points out that political communication cannot just be about what he calls logos, cannot just be about the rational argument. It requires two other things as well. It requires pathos, which is emotion, and it requires ethos, which is the sense of character. And of course, what the populists do so well is to do the pathos bit, or some version of the pathos bit. They're unbelievably good at finding how to get the great slogans going again, dust them off the shelf where the technocrats and the centrists have left them, bring back words like patriotism, nation, liberty, sacrifice. And above all, the secret really of Boris Johnson and Donald Trump is they bring back something that all the other politicians are lacking, which is a sense of humor. Right? They're terrible human beings, but they are funnier than the other lot. And this is part of their secret power. However, what Aristotle suggests, and I'm going to finish with 5 Aristotelian concepts, because I talk in 5s. I don't know why I talk in 5s now. Maybe I'd be better talking in 3s. So I want you to think about 5 Aristotelian concepts. I want you to think about those 3 rhetorical concepts, the idea of logos, pathos, and ethos. I want you to think about the notion of hope, which in Greek is called elpis, but particularly in Aristotle is euelpis, good hope. And I want you to think about his notion of eudaimonia, particular Aristotelian notion of happiness or flourishing. What I think he would say to our predicament, and I understand I don't have, luckily for you, 4 hours to talk about all the problems in this argument. And I'd like to point out that there is a big problem with taking somebody who lived in ancient Athens and applying him to the current day. For example, he didn't have an iPhone, and he wasn't aware of social media and the developments of the global market system, and he wasn't particularly attuned to artificial intelligence. So take that as read. However, I think there is something very interesting in the way Aristotle approaches the world, which provides an antidote to what was bad about the smug consensus of the 1990s, and is also an antidote to what is deeply disturbing, immoral, and in some ways horrifying about the age of populism, as follows. He would say, firstly, that in order to deal with an age of polarization, my souffle, with the votes at the elbows and not in the center, we need to understand that the notion of pathos, the notion of emotion, needs to find what Aristotle would call the golden mean, the intermediate state, the moderation between 2 extremes. And those 2 extremes are, of course, the boring technocratic fantasies, the centrists, and the hysterical emotions of the populists. And that intermediate state finds itself in the word empathy. The point about empathy, the emotion of empathy, is that it's emotion directed towards understanding the other, towards moving from this towards that. Absolutely central, because the core values of our democracies lies in the idea of compromise, lies in the idea of equality, the moral equality of human beings, which requires that we do not say that only 25% of us can countenance our children marrying somebody from the other side. Right? Empathy requires understanding these alternative positions. That's the pathos bit. The second thing that obviously needs to be addressed in my story is the story about the connection between a particular market system and economic growth. And here I think we need to look at the Aristotelian notion of logos. But the point about Aristotelian logos is it avoids, on the one hand, the problem of the centrists of the 90s, which is the problem of universalizing abstraction, jargon, and avoids, of course, the deep irrationality and the refusal to engage with facts, which is so characteristic of the populists. Instead, Aristotelian logos is embedded. It's a practice of practical reason which takes into account the place you're in, the historical moment you're in, the constraints that you face, the moral context in which you operate, and which begins to move away from saying to somebody in the northeast of England, you don't fit the market system, and therefore either you're going to be forgotten or somehow in some magical way your life's going to be transformed in a way that none of us can anticipate, but instead actually engages with the reality of why governments need to get involved in markets, why industrial strategies, which are flexible and thoughtful, could make sense, and why it makes sense to make decisions across our country which are not purely based on return on investment, which can take into account landscape, environment, and deep structural injustices. The third thing that we talked about was the relationship between economic growth, or economies, free market economies, and democracy. And here, I want to try to examine another notion in Aristotle. Right, so we've talked about pathos, we've talked here about the notion of logos. What was the third one? Anyone remember? Ethos, right? Okay, so the point about ethos here is to try to embed in the way in which we think about our relationship to democracy an understanding that democracy is not simply about the production of economic goods, that moral virtues are central to what matters about democracy, that democracy is not an instrumental means to an end, that notions of our rights, our liberty, our equality as citizens, and in fact what Aristotle would call the joint activity of politics, is central to what makes human life livable. The fourth one of these things that I was talking about is the loss of the sense of our moral legitimacy. And in the loss of the sense of moral legitimacy, I want to return to the idea of eudaimonia, the Aristotelian idea of happiness. Because the Aristotelian idea of happiness, again, is not simply vested in a means-end calculation. Its response to social movements is to say that happiness is not an end, it's an activity. And in particular, politics is a joint activity. It's a communal activity. It's an activity where ethical considerations combine with the practical considerations in the definition together of the good life. And the fifth is, of course, the question of the collapse of the liberal global order. And it's here where I want to appeal to the notion of euelpsis. I want to appeal to the notion of good hope. Because what characterized the first stage I talked about in the 1990s was unmoored optimism, a form of abstracted fantasy, which assumed that it was going to be possible to turn Iraq and Afghanistan into liberal democracies, that generated books called A Beginner's Guide to Nation Building. And the populist era was defined by a form of extreme pessimism. Many of these forms of nationalism are based on a deep, profound pessimism. But what Aristotle's euelpsis does is it says that the hope that matters is based on a courage that acknowledges failure, acknowledges fear. Again, it's an intermediate point where the courage responds to the fear and avoids foolhardiness. The courage is the intermediate ground between paralysis, which could be very easy, faced with this rather gloomy story I've given of the world's evolution, but also avoids the idea of slick, unconvincing fairy stories. Instead, it is rooted, it's granular, it finds its position in a tradition, in a place, in a country, because that form of hope acknowledges, and it's on this that I wish to conclude, that if we can often do much less than we pretend, we can do much more than we fear. Thank you very much indeed.
What a spectacular talk. Good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Elliott. I'm the provost of Gresham College. And I'm going to take questions from the floor and then allow Rory to continue this stunning speech. And I think we have one right at the front.
Rory, thank you very much for, how you do it without notes. It's just confounded all of us, but it's amazing. I really want to take you up on the logos point. I'm a banker, so I follow financial markets. We're about to see one of the biggest seismic moves of finance and of wealth moving from one generation to another like $100 trillion will do so, to a generation that are very angry with the previous generation, who themselves have a redefinition of the logos, because, not to name any names, we all know, my truth is what I want to feel for today, which could absolutely destroy the capitalist system.
And how's the transfer happening?
From one generation to another.
What's the mechanism of the transfer?
Death, bank of mum and dad, and the huge increase in capital that we've never seen before as a result of quantitative easing, asset inflation, people who own their homes and the next generation can't own their homes. And Ray Dalio, one of the leading hedge funds, has estimated that this continues, there's a 30% chance of a civil war in the US. When you see this intergenerational inequity, how do you think we should be responding to it?
I think this is a very, very deep and fundamental problem. In the story that I gave of these change between different periods, one of the defining pieces of opinion research is that at the end of my first 1990s period, the majority of people in the United States and Europe believe their children are going to be better off than they are. 2014, the beginning of the period of populism, is the moment at which the majority of people believe their children are going to be worse off than they are. And it is very troubling in a whole series of ways. It's not simply that intergenerational inequity is profound. One of the things that's very misleading about the Occupy Wall Street movement is the Occupy Wall Street movement suggests that the fundamental problem in our society is about the 1%. It's very, very tempting to think there's this 1% and we're all the 99%. And politicians like that because they want to feel that they've embraced the majority of their voters feeling like victims against this group. But in fact, actually, if you look at Britain, the division is more between the 60% who own property and the 40% who don't. If you don't look at incomes but look at wealth, that is the fundamental inequity in our country. People who own houses are much, much, much better off, basically, than people who don't. And people who own houses tend to be older than people who don't. And a lot of our assumptions in our pension system and things, basically at the moment, when we model pensions, we assume that the pensioner doesn't pay a mortgage and doesn't pay rent. Because almost all pensioners in the United Kingdom today do not do those things. But the generation that's coming may well end up doing those things. It's also true that we have another problem, which is that our societies are based on the assumption of growth, have to be based on the assumption of growth, because our societies are aging, our pension costs are therefore necessarily increasing, people are living longer, and the inflation in healthcare is always 2 or 3 times the growth of your economy. So healthcare inflation in most developed economies is 6-7% a year at the moment. That's because drugs are more expensive, but it's also simply that we live longer, and it's also that we go to the doctor more. However, a lot of our assumptions around climate change and the environment are increasingly trying to come to terms with the possibility that infinite growth in a planet with finite resources ultimately cannot continue forever. And it's certainly questionable whether the ideas of green growth are really going to deliver. To make it even worse, most of the policies that we are currently introducing to deal with climate change are regressive. In other words, they have their biggest impact on the poor, not on the wealthy. Why is that? That's because the way in which we get people to convert from carbon consumption to non-carbon consumption is we tax their use of those things. We tax the fuel they put in the car, we tax their energy at home. Now, that, of course, from an economically rational point of view, makes sense. You put taxes on those things, you incentivize people to change their behavior. But of course, for the wealthy, those things are a much, much smaller proportion of their income, of their expenditure, than they are for the poor. And we saw this with what happened with Russia. There was a tiny glimpse of a much, much bigger problem coming. As soon as Russian gas stopped, we were forced into an energy transition, which was immediately felt in people's gas prices. At which point the government then suddenly had to introduce forms of economic policy, which we've spent 40 years telling everyone in the world not to do. I used to go on these missions with colleagues from the World Bank and the IMF, telling off people for putting energy price caps on or subsidizing their electricity, and that's, of course, exactly what the British government ended up doing. So what are the solutions to these problems? I think they're going to be very, very, very difficult and very, very radical. They are going to involve much more radical taxation. They're going to involve probably larger wealth taxes. I think one of the smartest proposals on this is Theresa May's proposal on adult social care, which is that you fund adult social care by taking the money out of someone's house after they die. And in essence, during your life, you live in your house, you pay for your social care, and the government then gets the value of that house when you die and redistributes it. But remember, Theresa May lost the 2017 election on that single policy. But she went from a projected 150-seat majority to losing her majority on that. So the politics of doing any of these things is very difficult. And industrial strategy is necessary, right? We need to shift money up to the northeast of England. But the one thing we know about governments doing industrial strategy is it's never honest. And the politics gets into it. They're not making rational choices on what to invest in. Even if they were able to see into the future and know which industries they needed to do, even if they could be certain that having a giga battery factory in Britain was the way forward, or manufacturing wind turbines in Britain was the way forward, sure as eggs, where they put that money in the industries they invest in are actually deeply, deeply inflected by their political and voting calculations, not really by a rational economic analysis. So I haven't really answered your question except to make it even gloomier and more depressing, because most of the moves we'll have to make will be politically impossible. Yeah.
I can give you another one.
Good.
So someone in outer space is sending in this question, which I think is quite relevant following that. Given that we seem to be rushing headlong into climate disaster, and given that we've seen the political changes you so beautifully describe, maybe we need autocracies to pull us back from the brink, because the systems we've had in current traditional democratic government have failed to react sufficiently quickly.
So this is, of course, another very dangerous and very tempting idea. So in a moment of crisis, it's very tempting to think that democracies are too slow, that democratic politicians are too affected by electoral cycles. And this is, of course, what the Chinese government wants to project. The Chinese government is basically trying to say, we can plan 20, 30 years in the future. We can make the big moves that are necessary, whether on industrial strategy or the green transformation and climate change. And the democracies are finished because they're too slow, too bureaucratic, too incompetent. And I don't know what the answer to this is. I mean, my instinct is very strongly on the side of the democracies. But my instinct is on the side of the democracies partly on ethical, moral grounds, partly because I believe that actually our lives benefit from liberty, our lives benefit from rights, our lives benefit from voting, that these notions of equality are important. I'm also extremely skeptical about the efficiency of autocratic systems in the long run. I think their feedback and response mechanisms are poor. But perhaps most important of all, the one thing that democracies deliver in a slow, uneven fashion is the necessity of consent. Getting consent is really painful, right? The reason HS2 will be very expensive is we have to negotiate with every community all the way along the way, and apparently in China, you just run the rail line and you don't care, right? But ultimately, if you are to sustain a policy, if you are to actually do radical things that are going to end up with people making sacrifices and costing them money and lead a very, very difficult transition, you have to bring people with you. And the electoral system, the democratic electoral system, is a really important forcing mechanism for forcing politicians to listen, forcing politicians to explain, forcing politicians to try to bring people with them. And in the end, I think, although slower, that's probably a surer and more sustainable way to tackle climate change than trying to impose it from above.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions from the audience. Let's go close to you at the back. There's a hand up. And one just there as well.
Pretty obvious why you left party politics. But can you tell me, what are the prospects that you'll come back into party politics in this country?
I don't know what the prospects are. I feel, currently, I feel that these issues are immensely important. And I feel that I'm sort of, I'm facing a sort of block of stone, and I have a kind of chisel. And at the moment, I'm sort of scraping along the surface. And I have to find the angle to bring the chisel down and cleave this thing apart. And I don't know how that's done. I don't know whether that's done through elected parliamentary politics. How I get back into politics, I mean, we're in a first-past-the-post system. I'm certainly not rejoining the Conservative Party anytime soon. So it's so there's a question of a how. There's also the other thing, which is that I'm not sure how good a politician I am. In a couple of ways. One of them is that I find the business of being a politician very, very bad for me. It's bad for my mind, it's bad for my body, it's bad for my soul. I end up becoming a vain, slightly immoral person who ceases to listen. I mean, politicians not only don't think, they don't listen. After about 10 years, a politician is incapable of listening to anybody. Finding a route that allows me to try to defend some form of values and make changes is something I'm still struggling with. Yeah.
Let's take another question. I think we had one more at the back there beforehand. Yes.
Thank you very much for your talk. Do you have a view on how Margaret Thatcher fits into these developments and changes that you've spoken about tonight?
Yeah. I think she is important in this because I think she established with Reagan the consensus of what, in the end, came through in 1989. And I think it was a worldview that was, in many ways, its liberation of the markets, its consensus on privatization, on deregulation, on the shrinking of the state, on the lowering of taxes, on a shift away from society to the individual. These things definitely powered economic growth. I mean, in terms of GDP growth, Britain from the mid-1980s to 2008 began for the first time to grow more quickly than the United States by the 1990s and was finding itself the second fastest productivity growth in the G7. So on the kind of things that liberal market economists want to measure, it achieved an enormous amount. And of course, the transfer of council houses to many council house residents gave them wealth, gave them assets that they didn't have before that they were able to then put to use. But the consequences of this are also very troubling and very disturbing in the long run and lay the ground for a lot of what is now populism, because of course this is also the period of the hollowing out of the traditional industries in the northeast of England, the removal of affordable housing from the country through the selling off of the council estates, increasing inequality, a sense of the individual and the loss of a confident way of talking about society. Because in its essence, what's revealed there is that the liberal markets unleashed are not really conservative in the sense of Edmund Burke's conservatism. They're not really slow-moving, prudent, restrained, traditional. They are upending everything very, very dramatically. And as the inequities or cruelty of that is exposed, many of the other problems that we then see in terms of the moral legitimacy of the West, the relationship to democracy, and the liberal global order begin to have relationships to that development.
Thank you. What do you think about citizens' assemblies as a way of organising politics? And do you think they have much chance of taking off?
Okay, I love citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies, very quickly, for people in the room who aren't familiar with them, it's essentially like a large jury. The idea is that you do a census of the population, and then you randomly select a group of, it could be 300 people, who are meant to be representative of the country as a whole. And these people will be demographically representative, and you gather them in a room, and you put them with experts. So it'll be a room about this size, about this number of people, and they will have presentations on various issues, and they will debate them, and they will discuss them, and they will come forward with a recommendation. And what you tend to find is extraordinary results, which are actually much more impressive than you get out of a parliament. Whenever I say this to my colleagues in parliament, they say, we don't need a citizens' assembly, we're the citizens' assembly. But the truth of the matter is that 300 randomly selected citizens do not come with strong partisan agendas. They don't have strong party political agendas. And they tend to find their way towards compromise in the middle ground much more easily. The classic example was in Ireland. This is what resolved the arguments around abortion in Ireland. Because what happened, and you cannot imagine, in the Republic of Ireland, you cannot imagine a society in which abortion was a more controversial issue. But by putting people in a room and getting experts up talking about trimesters and the biology of human evolution and raising legal questions around rape, you actually found the debate going from a for and against to a how many weeks debate. And this is incredibly important. It would have been incredibly important in Brexit if we'd managed to get a citizens' assembly. We could have got away from Brexit Remain towards what is a softer, more workable compromise Brexit, a customs union. For my money, right? And indeed, when we did citizens' assemblies around it, that's in fact what they ended up with, because they were thinking about Northern Ireland borders, and they were thinking about trade with Europe, but they were also trying to acknowledge the fact that 52% of people had voted to leave, and they were trying to accommodate that. So I'm a real believer in citizens' assemblies, and I think they have powerful wisdom and powerful legitimacy and powerful consensus-building mechanisms embedded in them, and I'd like to see many more of them.
Hi. I just thought that the politicians' parties, they don't know what they're missing without you. Two things. You didn't mention Ukraine and public service sector workers, nurses, doctors, teachers. What do we do with them?
Two very, very big questions. Public sector workers, I think, obviously we are in a situation in which many people in our society feel they're in a very precarious situation. And public sector workers are one of those groups. They feel, in many ways, that their salaries are not keeping up with inflation. And that's partly because the inflation indicators that we look at are not revealing the full extent of the pressures that they're facing. Particularly if you're operating in the southeast of England, the real expense of getting a house, the real expense of looking after yourself. At the same time, more and more is being asked of them. At the same time, respect for politicians, civil servants, is at an all-time low. We're a long way beyond a fantasy 19th century world where in your village or town you doffed your cap to the teacher and the doctor and the priest, and these people were great sort of figures of authority and respect. We're in a world now where people feel abused. They feel attacked on every side, and this is one of the many elements, along with inequities in pay and pensions, which is driving public sector anger. But at the same time, of course, you notice that Keir Starmer is not promising to increase their salaries, because it's very, very difficult to see where the money is coming from to pay for all these things. In part because, as I say, the expansion and the cost of our healthcare and pensions is beginning to outstrip almost every other part of government spending. Ukraine. Well, Ukraine, of course, in a sense, represents the beginning of a final age, an age that started in February of last year, which I didn't get onto, which, of course, is the move from the age of populism to the age of global conflict, and in which the attack by Vladimir Putin on attempts to get to Kiev not only disrupted most of the complacent assumptions or whatever complacent assumptions remained in the liberal order, but also has begun to clarify a new emerging Cold War between the United States and China, because, of course, Russia-Ukraine presages and points towards tensions between China and Taiwan. The problems of trying to decouple our economies from the Russian economy, which was, deeply, deeply damaging in terms of our fuel prices, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, which imports 60% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine, but will be to a power of 20 if we begin to start thinking about decoupling from China, because currently, Taiwan produces 50% of the world's semiconductors, 90% of the world's advanced semiconductors. And if trying to imagine a world without Russian gas is difficult, imagining a world without semiconductors is almost impossible. And that's before you get on to the fact that 50% of the profits of European automobile and luxury goods manufacturers are made in China, 50% of their profits in China, but also 50% of their growth in China. So China is a problem 20 times larger than Russia. In fact, so much so that we shouldn't be thinking about decoupling at all. We should be thinking, if we were Aristotle, in terms of de-risking. And de-risking has a double meaning. De-risking means, yes, occasionally thinking about resilience, not having all our eggs in that basket, but de-risking also means actively engaging with China to lower the chance of a confrontation and a conflict, and trying to work out what we do about the situation in the United States, which is really beginning to build allies for what seems like a new Cold War.
Thank you very much. I'm going to have to draw an end to the questions. But first, I want to just say it's been an unbelievable privilege to listen to you talk tonight. It's clear that from the murmurings in the audience that they feel that politics has lost something important, which is potentially regainable with any luck. It's great for those of us who are engaged in speaking from time to time to see such fluency, such a noteless presentation, such clarity, and the ability to précis complex issues essentially on the fly. It's extremely impressive. And we're very grateful to you for doing it. I would also like to say it's no surprise to me that your podcast is so successful. And I think that those of you who haven't heard the rest of Politics, you've probably missed a great treat, and they're all available to listen to. And we look forward to many more of them. I'd just like also to say that there's a wonderful overlap between what you've spoken about and the series of talks to be given by our new professor of rhetoric starting in October of this year. Melissa Lane, who's professor of political philosophy in Princeton, is going to be talking about the impact of classical democracies on modern politics, and it will be an extremely interesting series. I hope you'll listen. Thank you for your insights. It has genuinely been a privilege, and I hope you'll join me in thanking Rory Stewart for an outstanding Thomas Gresham lecture.